Please help!
Are we gonna help him?
No.
Welcome back to Londonsaurus. I'm Paige, and today we're going to be doing a breakdown of The Last of Us Episode 4. We'll be explaining the ending, some Easter eggs, and also some things that you may have missed along the way. So make sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell button for more videos like this in the future. Jumping straight into it then, we start the opening scene with Ellie practicing shooting in a mirror. She's obviously taken Bill's gun and she's practicing how she's going to shoot someone. And this is quite foretelling for what happens later on in the episode, which we'll come to in a bit. But it's a really key opening scene and it kind of gets us into the mindset of what that world is like. You know, a kid has a gun. She's practicing when she's going to shoot somebody, and this is probably going to be a very realistic life lesson that Ellie is going to have to learn. What I really liked about the start of this episode is that they try to bring a lot of humour into this episode. If you notice at the start, Ellie has a book called No Pun Intended Volume 2. This is actually a collectible item in The Last of Us Part 1 in the game. And it's really interesting to see this. There's lots of little items that the eagle-eyed gamers might spot, but the scenes play out slightly differently from the game, especially when they are travelling to Kansas City rather than Pittsburgh. But there's a lot of direct dialogue from the game as well, which is really, really interesting. Also, when they're in the car and Joel's driving and Ellie's rummaging through Bill's stuff in the car seat, she discovers an adult magazine and jokingly asks why are the pages stuck together. And this is definitely a scene that's lifted word for word from the video game, even to the point where Ellie tosses the magazine out of the window. One thing that you may have noticed is when Joel and Ellie are walking, the camera pans down to a pile of burnt corpses that are basically unrecognisable. Clickers are weak against fire, so these people were probably killed by uninfected, most likely the rebels that are, becoming the threat in this episode. And in the video game, this is a big warning to the player that they're entering a dangerous settlement and to keep their guard up. And I think this does the exact same thing in this episode, because shortly after we meet the group of militant rebels. I think the biggest thing that we take away from this episode is that the relationship between Joel and Ellie develops massively here, especially in an emotional capacity. So we start off the scene, Ellie's making dad jokes. Joel is just not interested at all. He's got all of his walls up. I think he's obviously hurt from losing Tess, but I think as well there's parts of Ellie that really remind him of his own daughter, and it hurts too much to let someone in like that again, obviously from what happened with his own daughter. A big key difference that we see in the episode in relation to the game is that they're actually going to Kansas City rather than Pittsburgh, which is where they went to in the game. But if you notice, the bridge that they cross is kind of a reference to the Pittsburgh bridge in the game, which is where the hunters are protecting. The main new character who we meet is Kathleen, and she's the leader of this militant rebel faction who have obviously taken over the city from Fedra's hands. Now, Kathleen is what looks to be this kind of sweet, motherly woman who you would never expect to have a bad bone in her body, but obviously the events of the world have turned her quite sour. At the start, when we first meet her, she's questioning a doctor who actually brought her into the world, and you can kind of see that there's a part of her humanity that she is wrestling with. She wants to avenge her brother who was sold out to Fedra and obviously was killed as a result. And she's after this Henry guy because he's the one who sold out her late brother. She's convinced that this doctor knows something, and when we find out that Joel and Ellie have killed two of their tribe, rather than kind of focusing on the fact that there's two outsiders, she automatically links them down to this Henry guy who she's after. So she basically riles the entire team of militants to go and search for Henry and his accomplices. I think this will ultimately be a detriment to herself, because you can tell in the eyes of the other people who she's leading that they're starting to kind of waver in this vengeful plot of hers. It's getting a bit tiring for them. But we definitely see that Kathleen has quite a cold side to her as well. Like, she is really, really mad about her brother, so much so that she doesn't even hesitate when she goes and kills the doctor, who actually could have been really, really useful to them. Now, Kathleen's story doesn't have the same excitement that Bill and Frank's story had, but I think this is the story that's going to develop over the next couple of episodes. And obviously one of the biggest signs that this storyline is going to become quite a big one is when they go into the basement of a building and there's this gurgling sinkhole, which from the trailers that we have seen, we can only assume is this bloater, and that's probably the most likely to be under that floorboard. And from this trailer footage, it seems like that is going to be a problem that will come and bite them back in the ass. And I think what's really interesting here as well is Perry's trying to explain to Kathleen how panicked, how worried, how concerned he is about this potential bloater coming out. And Kathleen's so hell-bent on revenge for her brother that she just doesn't see it as that big of a problem. And she's like, you know, just shut the building, we'll come back to it later. And ultimately, I think this is going to be part of her demise. And I think as well, this is going to be part of the group kind of turning in their mentality of following her as a leader. You can see it in Perry's eyes that he's starting to doubt her leadership skills because she's just so focused on getting revenge that she's not actually looking out for what's best for the group. You know, 2 people have died and all she can think about is, oh, it must be Henry and Sam's friends. They must have called people in. We need to find them immediately before they find us. And I think that's really interesting because obviously the hunters are all following Kathleen, but I don't think that's going to be the case for long, and ultimately that might blow up an internal fight. In the original game, bloaters that are infected and have lived with this parasite for over 2 decades can have hardened fungal plates over their body. Much like the clickers in episode 2 that we saw, they had them on their heads. In the Pittsburgh section of the game, there is a bloater that is found underneath a hotel, which kind of hints at this bloater that's potentially underneath the basement here. So I think it's going to be the almighty bloater that we see in the trailer. Obviously, if you've played the game, then you'll know where this is going, but please don't leave any spoilers in the comments for those who haven't. We end this what has been quite a tame episode with Joel and Ellie finally kind of breaking through this barrier in their relationship. They've shared a bit more of their stories throughout this episode, which was really nice to see them opening up to one another. But it's even better when Ellie finally tells another dad joke, and this time Joel finally laughs. And to see them giggling is just such a sweet ending to this episode. And you kind of start to think, oh, all's going to be fine, that, you know, it's going to be this beautiful relationship that's going to be blossoming. But obviously danger is always just around the corner in The Last of Us, and just as you think they are going to fall asleep and all is going to be fine again, just as Joel feels like he can finally relax and actually sleep because the last few nights he's actually just been staying up to protect Ellie, then he gets woken up by Ellie screaming at him because Henry and his brother are actually holding them at gunpoint. It's going to be really interesting to see if Henry and his brother's storyline is the same as the game. They are really big characters, so I'm excited to see where they take the storyline. Hopefully it'll be similar to the game, but as we're in a different location, there's been a few small differences in the storyline. They might explore another avenue with Henry and his brother, so one to keep an eye on for next episode. One thing that's evidently different in Henry and Sam's story is that in the Last of Us game, Henry and Sam are just part of a travelling group that enters Pittsburgh for supplies, and this is how they end up meeting. And then their group is ultimately attacked by the hunters, with Henry and Sam being the only survivors. However, in this episode, Henry and Sam's story seems to have changed a bit, which will undoubtedly be explored in episode 5 and probably, tie more directly into the hunters and their motivation. It's interesting that in this episode as well, we see a lot more development into the storyline of the hunters. Obviously, in the game, it doesn't really allow for that much storyline for the hunters, whereas this one, we can clearly see a motivation as to why the hunters are as brutal and as cold killing as they are. They're obviously after a certain couple of people, Henry and Sam, and they're out for revenge, so Ellie and Joel should really be careful. If we've missed any Easter eggs, if you've spotted anything that we've not seen, please let us know in the comments below, and please make sure to like and subscribe